Well, good afternoon, everyone. Congratulations to our conference goers for finding your way down the hill and then into the basement. Again, we are moving around a little bit in these few days. I wonder, is anyone here from the Augustinian Scholars Program? Sort of, yes, right. A word of context for those of you who are just joining us. You are joining us in the midst of the Conversation on the Liberal Arts. This is an annual conference put together by the Gady Institute for the Liberal Arts, where we take up some topic having to do with the present and future of liberal education. This year we are taking as our theme liberal education and its relevance to making positive social change. How do places that have a liberal arts identity especially equip their students to go out into the world and make a difference? A quick word about format, again, if you're just joining us. We'll reserve about the first 35 or 40 minutes for formal comments. We'll take a brief break. You can grab some refreshments. And we hope at that point that you'll come back in to join us for an extended time of question and answer and open conversation. We're privileged this afternoon to have a Westmont alum with us who is doing some exciting things in social entrepreneurship. Connected to her liberal arts education. To introduce her, we have Professor Rick Ifland. Rick is the chair of the Economics and Business Department here at Westmont and director of the new Eaton Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Rick.
Well, thank you, Aaron. It's good for me to be here, and it's a real privilege to introduce to you Rachel Goble. I've known the Goble family for years and years and years. Her father and I served on the board of trustees. Her dad still serves on the board of trustees, but we served together and I got to know them quite well. Our youngest son went on a May term at Westmont to Thailand. That was directed by Rachel, so we've been able to see some of the good work that she has done firsthand through our son. Rachel is the co-founder and president of the SOLD Project. The SOLD Project focuses on exploitation of women and children, and they have a focal point in Thailand, but an audience really around the world. She is a Westmont graduate in the Economics and Business Department, so she has a background both in management and in marketing. She also has a master's degree in intercultural studies at Fuller Seminary. And I think it was at Fuller that she first went to both India and then Thailand and began this journey that she is on. She has produced 3 different films that are related to this topic, Travel With Us and 5 Years, and then the SOLD Project, Thailand. She also is a frequent speaker throughout the United States. And the SOLD Project itself has been the recipient of the Nike's Girl Effect Award in 2013. And it's also known as one of the top tier greatnonprofits.org nonprofit organizations. So very well respected. Rachel herself has been a finalist for the prestigious Edna Social Justice Award. I think that was in about 2012. And so it's a privilege to introduce her. The topic of her conversation is empathy. And I can't think of a family that is more empathetic than the Goble family. Again, you've touched our lives with Crawford just being so positively affected by his trip to Thailand. Empathy is, it's not distant. Empathy is near. And because it's near, empathy makes it kind of messy when you get involved in some things. So I'm not sure of the topic that you're going to be talking about, but Rachel is someone who just wants her life to matter, and she's leaned into a really difficult issue and done so with empathy and done so just by kind of getting messy with people. And it's just a privilege to introduce Rachel Goble.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rick. That was very gracious of you. And Crawford, I think, in turn, has also inspired me. In this work that I do, it's very easy to let your perception of men fall. And I think traveling with someone like Crawford, a young Westmont student, and spending time with him, he was one of our 2 male students that came actually on that trip. So he was in a sea of women. And he really continued to, I think, give me hope and also to really set, I think, an example that is really, really needed for what it looks like for men to respect women and to love women. And so I loved spending time with Crawford in the red light districts of Bangkok. That will forever actually be ingrained in my memory. He was working on a documentary film at the time and asked me to go with him while he filmed so he wouldn't be alone. So thanks to you as well for your family and for the gracious introduction. I'm really pleased to be here today. When Chris Heckley invited me to come and share about my liberal arts education at Westmont, how it's influenced my work with the SOLD project, I honestly was not sure what direction I would take that in. And it wasn't because I had any questions about my education, but more because I hadn't spent a lot of time reflecting on how Westmont and the liberal arts cultivated within me a desire to do the work that I do. And so for the last about 4 months, I guess it's been, since we first had our conversation, I've spent a lot of time reflecting. What was it about Westmont, for positive or for negative, that really prepared me for the work that I am doing today? And so I think to start off, I wanted to share a fun family story. This is a picture of me and my little brother and my grandfather. And as I was thinking through the impact of liberal arts, obviously one of the main conversations that comes up in that is STEM. Looking at science, technology, engineering, and math, and the impact that that's having as we put people through the education system and get people ready for the job market. And so my younger brother, I think the 2 together would probably be a good case study, but he now has been going into his 9th year of trying to graduate with a liberal arts degree. He is 2 units short. He's missing a PE class. I did ask for his permission to share this. But in the last few years, while he's been in San Francisco, I'm from the Bay Area, he went to one of the top-notch coding schools, graduated at the top of his class, and now is sitting amongst about, I think the last I talked to him, he had about 8 different job offers from different startup companies, some funded, some not, all of which are paying him more at a starting salary than I am earning at a nonprofit I've been leading for 8 years. So I get the tension. That being said, my reflection on the work and the time I had here at Westmont really did bring me to a place where I wouldn't have traded it for anything. And so today I'm hoping to share some of that journey with you and as some stories as well. So to say that the liberal arts provides a diversity of experiences and proficiencies is almost an understatement. I spent some time reflecting on what I did during my time at Westmont, and I came up with a list. So my time at Westmont drew me to intern at a 5-star hotel in Hawaii, a battered women's shelter in Northern California, raise money for and co-lead Potter's Clay in Mexico, spend a semester in Australia and New Zealand, act as both the business manager and photo editor for the Horizon, draft a competitive business plan to open a jazz bar in my entrepreneurship class, attend poetry readings with Sherry Larson Heckley, and take economics with Paul Morgan, all which in some way, shape, or form helped me to think through the eyes and minds of people that are different than myself. I don't think that's a list that you can find when you go to coding school. That being said, I also graduated with a very subpar GPA and was nowhere near ready for the real world. It would have been incredibly easy to be overlooked and dismissed, but thanks to the hands-on care of my professors, the size of my classrooms, and the culture of the school, I wasn't lost in the system. I had professors that saw what I needed. I can vividly remember the day that Dr. Roy Millender told me that he had observed that I had learned how to learn. And I'm not entirely sure what he meant when he said that. I don't necessarily remember the switch in myself, but I appreciated that he had noticed it in me. Looking back, I imagine that I probably moved from memorization and regurgitation to seeing the big picture, asking the critical questions, and trying to understand concepts rather than recite facts. I was, and still humbly am, not the biggest fan of public speaking, My entrepreneurship professor, Kevin Mills, not only provided a space for impromptu persuasive speeches, but I actually won them. And he saw something in me those days that allowed him to begin coaching me past my fears. It's these illustrations that paint a picture of liberal arts education. It's the betterment of the entire human, not just a skill set to be achieved or a talent to be perfected and marketed. To be frank, I can only imagine that the work of a liberal arts educator is exhausting work. It would be much easier and much more direct to simply provide a set of talents and move on. But instead, we engage with the questions. We ask the who, what, where, when, and why, are taught to think critically, and in the end, hopefully, learn not only why we believe what we believe, but also that there may be many more perspectives than just our own. It's understanding the difference between GPA and learning. A GPA doesn't reflect the changes in you. It doesn't reflect your leadership growth, your intellectual changes, your confidence changes, or even your global perspective. I interpret the liberal arts as creativity and critical thinking. In other words, liberal arts should train students to thrive in subjectivity and ambiguity, a necessary skill in a world where few things are black and white. If social issues were black and white, solutions would have been found by now. But the reality is that issues and people are multidimensional, not two-dimensional. While the majority of my thoughts today will be focused on social impact work, I did want to take a minute to quote a few of our leaders from the tech world as well. Because even in the tech world, which could easily be seen as a world in which you may only need a coding degree of some sort of technical training to enter into, liberal arts are still very much valued. Steve Yi, the CEO of Media Alpha, says, in the dynamic environment of the technology sector, there is not typically one right answer when you make decisions. There are just different shades of how correct you might be. And Steve Jobs mused that for technology to be truly brilliant, it must be coupled with artistry. He said it's in Apple's DNA that technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields the results that make our hearts sing. In other words, at the core of creating social change or tech breakthroughs is understanding what people want and need. Enter empathy. As I was reflecting on my own journey and story in context of my education, this is what kept coming back for me. Empathy gives you the ability to open yourself up to other people's perspectives, to understand what is important to them, what motivates them, and what their value system is. Empathy is not to be confused with sympathy. While sympathy is the ability to have compassion for that person, empathy is the ability to see something and feel something through someone else's eyes, to literally put yourself in their shoes. And this is where change happens, where needs are met and where beauty is born. I think the more that we empathize, the more we open ourselves up to the perspectives of others. And the word culture shock kept coming to mind for me. I don't know if the culture shock is necessarily as obvious as if you were coming ashore on a distant land, but I think that it's very real nonetheless. It's easier or more easier today than it ever has been before to be connected. I can Skype with my friends in Egypt. I can reach out to my staff in Thailand for Skype meetings with them. I can jump on the internet and find out who our 6th US president was or how to make the chicken that I want for dinner tonight. I think the point is that we have information at our fingertips. It is absolutely more easy today. That was horrible English. It is easier today than it ever has been before to be able to find varying viewpoints, to understand the way another person thinks, to Google the rebuttal of an argument, to understand what it means to be in a different faith. And all of this, I think this access to information in some way, shape, or form is leaving our world in a bit of a state of culture shock. I think differing perspectives aren't necessarily the only thing that can be disconcerting and confusing. The major economies influence the livelihood of the developing. We're living in the age of globalization. The various economies of the world are merging into one, making us all more dependent on and vulnerable to the actions of each other. When you add to this global climate change, unstable and confusing politics, regional conflicts and wars, population growth, income inequality, advances in technology, shanty towns, student debt, and human trafficking and exploitation, to name only a few of our problems, it's a wonder that we choose to engage at all. To reference Mary's talk from last night, she gave a beautiful illustration of something that moves from simple to complex to complicated. So simple might be like building a chair from IKEA. Complex like building an airplane, requiring trained specialists, but still with a guidebook nonetheless. I think that working with people is complicated. Injustice is complicated. It is not easy. There is no guidebook for it. Another way that we tend to deal with a culture shock of our interconnected and fractured world is by looking for simple explanations. From small things, like categorizing others based on the clothing that they're wearing or the things they say or the way that they say them, to larger things, like how we choose to understand global poverty or trafficking. We do this all the time, and not just with each other. We have a tendency to reduce complex things, processes, and people in order to categorize them and move on with our lives. Our brains do this for us. Each one of us has what's called a prototypicality for most of the things that we encounter. A prototypicality is simply just a fancy word for a mental image. So take the word dinosaur. What comes to mind when you hear the word dinosaur? I bet every single one of you has a mental image right now. It could be a triceratops or a pterodactyl, but every one of you has something in your mind that is produced when you hear the word dinosaur. And that image is your prototypicality for it. It's not only with dinosaurs or birds or animals that we do this, but with more complex issues of justice as well. What is your mental image for global poverty? For street children? For racism? Or for human trafficking? When it comes to most things that we encounter in our daily lives, not only do we have simplistic images for them, we also have subconscious mental boxes that we put them into. They might be labeled good or bad or safe or dangerous, acceptable or wrong. Like justice is good or injustice is bad. Traffickers are dangerous, NGO workers are safe. We use these boxes to sift through all the things that we come across on a daily basis. We reduce beautifully variegated people and beliefs to dehumanizing cliches. A classic example of this is how my understanding of the demand side of trafficking has shifted as my empathy has grown. When I first started working in the anti-trafficking world, I think it's very easy to point the finger at the John, which is a term that we would use for someone buying, or at the trafficker as the villain. I think the thing that has shifted for me as I begin to see things through their eyes is that I now have a deeper understanding of their motivations, their desires, and this empathy, this wanting to step into their shoes and understand, informs my work and allows me to be more effective because I'm able and willing to want to understand them. A mentor of mine is a woman named Bonita Thompson, and she is 70 years old, lives in Bangkok, and she's been working there for about 8 years now. When her husband's job relocated them to Bangkok, she began looking for what to do with her time. And she started volunteering with different anti-trafficking organizations in Bangkok that were all focused on rescue and aftercare. And over time, she began to realize that her passion, she had come from the education world, lied in education. And so she opened up her own organization called the Home of New Beginnings that seeks to reach out to young women that are in Bangkok's red light districts, one in particular, and offer them a way out. And then once they come out, if they choose, they can live in a home that she provides, and they help them finish their education. I love her model because of its sustainability, but the reality is that every single day she's hearing the stories of these women as they share the abuse of their past, or even as she does outreach in the red light districts. Seeing the Johns is not something that you can avoid. If anybody's been to Bangkok, you know what I mean by that. It's an area and a part of the country that has been inundated with sex tourism. And most of what you see on the surface are people that are coming from the West or China or Japan. But there's also much that's happening that's driven by local demand as well. And I think what Bonita has taught me in my relationship with her was the empathy that she has for these men, which I find incredibly hopeful. And she has taught me, and I have seen, that the majority of the men that go into these places are simply lonely, or they might not be able to find relationships in their home countries, or perhaps are continuing a cycle of abuse that started in their own families. And I bring this up because I think it's so easy. This is one of the most, what we would consider black and white issues, is to point our finger at the perpetrator, to point our finger at the villain, and to lose the empathy. And I am pleading that the empathy is what keeps us human. And that even as we reach out to the Johns and we reach out to the traffickers, that we remember that they have a story, and that we don't lose our empathy for them as well. And so while boxes and labels can be limiting, the fact that we use them, I don't think, is bad in and of itself. Categorizing our experiences in simplistic ways allows us to navigate a complex, rapidly changing, and confusing world without losing our minds. The danger, however, is twofold. If we only surround ourselves with people or books that we agree with, and therefore reinforce the way that we see the world, we start to believe that our way of seeing the world is the way of seeing the world, and we close ourselves off to learning new things and growing as an individual. The second way this is dangerous has to do with the ways we respond to the things we encounter in our now, like never before, interconnected world. So what comes to mind when you hear the words sex trafficking? A lot of people I know tell me that they immediately picture Brian and Kim Mills from the movie Taken. If anybody has seen that movie, Brian, played by Liam Neeson, is a former CIA operative who has to rescue his daughter Kim from a Parisian trafficking ring before she's sold to a Middle Eastern sheik. It's a popular movie with a third sequel that just came out last year, and so I'm not very surprised when I hear this. The problem is that while the picture it presents of human trafficking is true, the reality of trafficking and sexual slavery is almost always much more nuanced and complicated than the fictional picture that Taken presents. I say this not because Taken is a bad film, but to bring awareness to and think critically about the ways in which human trafficking is often portrayed in the media. Hollywood is not the only problem. When it comes to the news, whether due to the pressure of deadlines or the desire for hard data or for sales or for all of the above, it's often not much better. Numbers get exaggerated, actors and causes are misunderstood, and only those stories where victimization is clear and compelling get told. A recent expert on human trafficking in Thailand shared that there is more at stake here than academic nitpicking. I love this quote. It says that good intentions are not always beneficial if they lack clarity and understanding. It may be that in our enthusiasm to push for policies, programs, and legal mechanisms, we neglect the voices of the people themselves. The help that we wish to offer may become a hindrance. The idea of listening to the people that we're trying to help before we actually help them might seem obvious to you. But if you know anything about the NGO world and its history, you know that it has not been as obvious as it may seem. And so we today in the NGO world are starting to learn from many of our mistakes and placing more of our efforts towards developing local leadership so that solutions and innovation come from the people who know what is needed best. And I think as we think through the past failures, I wanted to bring up 3 different stories, and I call them learnings because the word failure can oftentimes have a negative connotation with it. At the Sold Project, we try to view failure as opportunity to learn and to grow, and that word has come up over and over at the conference, but learning how to fail well. And so the first is something called the play pump. Has anybody ever heard of the play pump before? Awesome. So the play pump was an idea that was supposed to bring drinking water to thousands of African communities by harnessing the play power of a child. And so in theory, this merry-go-round that you see in the image If kids are to play on this, as kids do, they play, then it is to pump water into that tank that will then provide clean drinking water to the entire community. What wasn't taken into consideration is that it took literally an entire day's worth of play to put water into that tank. And so what ended up happening was that the entire community, mothers, grandmothers, children, dads, would come out and just walk this merry-go-round in circles all day so that they could have access to clean drinking water. This has been harnessed in some ways as one of the poster failure stories, if you may, of the social development world. And I think with it comes a really important question, especially as you work with children, of what's the difference between play and work? Also, have you done your research? Is there actually water supply in that well that you're digging to last? And thirdly, who's going to maintain this? Are you training local communities to be self-sufficient? Or are you putting in something good that you can send out a report on and then moving on? Another is probably a product that we're all very familiar with called Tom's Shoes. There might be some people in this room right now wearing them. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you feel too guilty about it. But Tom's Shoes was one of the leading innovators, really, for looking at how business can have social impact. And so the story behind this, as you probably are all really familiar with, is that the model is that you buy one pair of shoes, and then through your purchase, you give a pair of shoes to a child in need. Well, the untold story that happened for years and years is that when Tom's would do shoe drops in different developing parts of the world, they would not only put local shoe companies out of business because they were bringing in a surplus of a product, shoes, but the shoes would also be then worn out in 6 months if they were ever even worn, because the majority of the kids that I know and I work with don't want to wear shoes. And so what ended up happening was that they created essentially a very excellent marketing pitch to have what was called social impact in the developing world, but actually ended up causing more harm than good. That being said, I think the positives of a model like Tom's Shoes are that they started to get the general public thinking about how do we have impact with our dollars that we spend. And they started to really revamp the way in which the consumer market looked at business and looked at their consumer power, whether it was identifying supply chains or looking for a foundation arm. But they really began to shift the way in which we view our power as consumers. Another exciting story that has come out of this is that they now have committed to 1/3 of their giving shoes being produced locally. And so they recently have opened up warehouse factories in Haiti. They actually started to respond to a lot of the criticism that they were receiving, which is really encouraging because they really have had so much impact on the social entrepreneurship space and were very revolutionary in their model. And so to see organizations and businesses learn from their failures and being willing to adapt is very encouraging. The third is one of our stories. So this is Kat. And Kat was our first ever scholarship recipient at the SOLD project. And I share her story just so that you can get an idea of how we began. And so Kat was 9 years old when we first met her. We were producing a documentary about child sex trafficking in Thailand. And our original story was going to be simply to unveil the truth behind child exploitation in Thailand. And in that process, we began to hear more and more stories of women, children, men, and where they had come from. And we began to ask the question of, well, where are people coming from that end up in situations of exploitation? And that took us to a tiny village in the north of Thailand. We had someone with us, which I think is crucial anytime you're starting any work of this sort, but we had a young man by the name of Tawi Donchai, who now acts as our on-the-ground executive director in Thailand. But Tawi began to share his vision for his community, and he began to tell the story of women, his peers, being trafficked as he was growing up. And so he remembers vans coming through his village. It's a very, unfortunately, classic story of how you might picture someone in a small rural village being trafficked. These vans would come through, offer jobs in the city. Girls would get in, they would disappear. They might come back a decade later. Some of them didn't come back at all and may still be working there. And Tawi had a deep desire and heart to see change happen in his community. And so he brought us to his village. We met Kat, and Kat was our inspiration for prevention. And Tawi and Kat began to teach us what the importance of education was. And so we offered Kat a scholarship, somewhat naively at the time, actually probably very naively at the time. Offered Kat a scholarship to help her stay in school because we saw the connection between education and opportunity. And her mother, at the time, very grateful, that allowed her to also stay in the community and not go back to Bangkok where she had been working for a number of years, but to stay in the community with her daughter and to be able to have that burden of educational cost taken off of her shoulders. And so for about a year, Kat was our only scholarship recipient, and then a year in, we admitted about 20 more students into our program. At the time, we were telling the story that education was the end-all, be-all, glamorous and wonderful solution to end trafficking. If only we could just educate all of the vulnerable children around the world, then trafficking would cease to exist. Of course, we know that that's not true. And through Kat and through Tawi, the organization began to learn more and more and more about what a holistic prevention program looks like. And so I share this story for a couple of reasons. First, I think, is the importance of moving slow. Anytime you're starting a new endeavor, it is so incredibly important to listen to your constituents, to empathize with what's happening. Even if you sit down and interview people in a community, you're not getting the whole story. Until you've gained trust, until you have people on the ground that you've recognized as leaders that you can then inspire and empower to go out and be change makers within their own communities, you don't have an organization. And so I think the importance of going slow and to be really listening. What do people want? What is the community ready for? When we first started, the community was really ready for education, but were they ready for mentorship? Mentorship is a foreign concept in Thailand. And since then, for anybody that works, especially domestically, I work a little bit in the foster care system, for example, we know the importance of mentorship, but that was an idea that took a while to introduce. And over time, we now have a strong mentorship program, but at the time, when I said the word mentorship, it wasn't even being translated correctly. And so it takes a while to figure out what exactly a community needs. Our other programs that we've since built out include a sustainability program. And our sustainability program also acknowledges the reality that the root factor for many of these families is poverty or lack of access to jobs. And so we started a sustainability program that actually incorporates silkworms into the homes of many of our students. And so the grandmothers that might be too old to work in the rice fields are able to grow silkworms. And I don't think I have the slides in today's presentation, but sometimes I'll put up a slide of our silkworm farm next to a picture of the red light district and say, what do these two things have in common? And I think it's in those moments that I'm reminded what social entrepreneurship is. It's when you figure out that silkworms can try to, or be a part of combating the exploitation of children. But it's these indirect solutions that aren't always as obvious when you first start that begin to show themselves to you the more that you listen and the more that you engage. And so out of this comes the messy. Rick, it's funny that you even pointed out the word messy when you were introducing, but I think that this concept of messy is something that we're all called into. I am a person of faith, and I believe that Jesus calls us into that messy. He asks us to get rid of our pre-assigned boxes that we use to label the unfamiliar and to bravely enter into the complexities of injustice. Human trafficking and the exploitation of children are some of today's most atrocious injustices, but it doesn't mean that they fit neatly into a box or that the pre-assigned image that we have of them is accurate. In fact, the how of human trafficking and the why of the exploitation of children is messy, layered, calculated, and yet completely unpredictable. And placing our assumptions on their stories only deepens that injustice. And so I wanted to share a story with you today that is extremely messy for me and ongoing. And her name is Mai. So I first met Mai when she was 7 years old. She's a twin sister. She's dyslexic and yet extremely bubbly, but she feels somewhat insecure in school because of her dyslexia, even though she's extremely intelligent. She's a daughter. Her mother, with a second-grade education, was a childhood victim of trafficking. Her father left her when she was very young. When Mai turned 13, she did what most teenage girls do. She got curious and restless. She wondered what else was out there in the world. I can relate to that. The village life was no longer interesting to her, and she longed for more. Couple this with a lack of oversight at home, a mom who, while loving, is impaired from years of drug and alcohol abuse, and you have a recipe for disaster. Mai began meeting boys on Facebook, and then she disappeared. She was trafficked to a karaoke bar in a district about an hour away from her home. With the collective help of the Sold Project staff and following her digital trail, we were able to locate her. Thankfully, it wasn't too dark. Dusk had not fallen, but the mental image painted to me by our Thai staff of her dressed scantily on a table will never leave me. She had been raped, beaten, drugged, and yet she still wanted to go back. Sorry. Gosh, I've shared this story so many times. This is why I write it out. Whew. And yet she still wanted to go back to the man that had trafficked her. We struggled with what freedom meant. We weren't her parents. Whew, sorry, guys. Her mom had been passive in the entire process. We didn't believe that locking her inside of a room was the solution to preventing this from happening again, but at the same time we asked, what is it? Or is it? We advocate for freedom, but what happens if our advocating for freedom goes so far as to temporarily take away their choice for the sake of protecting them? These are very messy tensions. We talked with her family, and she moved back home. Her twin sister had been traumatized by what was happening and started to express her worry that it wasn't over. 2 nights later, Mai was kidnapped from her room at home in the middle of the night, and she disappeared for days, and the entire northern Thailand police was looking for her. Eventually, she was found, and again, her body had been abused and broken. She was moved into a safe house that we partner with about 3 hours south and began the healing process. But 2 years later, she left. She missed home, she missed her sister, the staff at Soul that had become her mentors in her life. She didn't know anyone at the safe house and wanted to come home to what was familiar. And so I share her story because it's messy and it's ongoing. I don't have a conclusion to offer you. I have happy moments and I have hard moments, like this one. Moments of victory and moments of what felt like complete defeat. This is a story that involves looking beyond the trafficker, a story about breaking the mother-daughter cycle of prostitution and exploitation, which is not nearly as black and white as getting mad at the trafficker and rescuing the victim. And so I think sometimes when the world is falling apart, we ask, especially in the liberal arts world, why are we sitting here and reading a book? Our inclination, or at least the young people that I talk to, is often to want to drop that book, get on an airplane, and volunteer in the developing world or the inner city. I talk to a lot of young people who wonder if the money that they would spend on their education is actually worth it, or if they should instead save that money or avoid that debt and go straight into the social impact world. My answer to this, which I have stolen actually from Bryant Myers, one of my professors at Fuller, is the poor deserve our very best. The poor, or the 1%, are not dumb. In fact, they're far more innovative and self-sufficient than I, and probably you, will ever be. The poor know how to live off the land. They're incredibly creative and resourceful, and the idea that our middle to upper class lives have informed our empathy or ability to meet the needs and solve the problems of the poor is a giant red flag. Education is not only a time to read the books of those that have gone before us and learn from one another's successes and failures, but it's a time to expose ourselves to the opinions and the lives of people that are different than ourselves so that we may be humbled and hopefully realize that the more we learn, the less we know. We're gathered this week to look at how liberal arts education can help develop the traits critical for social change. I think in order to do this, we have to not only become aware of our prototypicalities, but to look at what hasn't worked and how we learn and grow from these lessons. I believe that assumptions are and can be the enemy to empathy. Assumptions can blind us to the actual needs. What happens at institutions like Westmont that provide students a utopian environment to think is that we learn to listen, not with our prototypicalities, but with all of our senses, all of our empathy, and all of our humility. The messiness of stories is neither a matter of pointing fingers, because, in fact, they are our stories. We are all contributors to the injustices that pervade us. And I wanted to end with this quote. I think inevitably we will begin, no matter what, building new boxes as time goes on that we choose to categorize things in. But Alvin Toffler said, "The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn." It's this learning that is the call to all liberal arts, faculty, and students, and I believe it is the learning that has shaped and continues to shape the foundation of how I think. Thank you.